You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy network.
Welcome back to the podcast with myself and Walker. In this episode, it's going to be a slightly different tack this week. I'm going to reproduce or indeed republish an episode which I recorded last week with kind permission from World Extreme Medicine on the Ukraine crisis. So in this episode, I'm interviewing Alione Hlivco, who is a former Ukrainian MP. I'm also interviewing Mark Hannaford, who's the CEO of World Extreme Medicine, and also Luca Alfatti, who's the Operation Director for Medics for Ukraine. And so what we wanted to do in the episode, indeed what we tackled in the episode, was the current climate, what it's like on the ground in Ukraine at the moment, a year on, and also some of the recent activity with Medics for Ukraine around teaching and training, the information governance, the risk profile as it's seen on the ground in the country, some of the logistical challenges in the country and how that's changed, and also the diversity of medical distribution and some of the cases that they're seeing on the ground. So I found the episode and indeed the interview really informative actually, and really insightful from a number of reasons. So I wanted to release it here just to tackle some of the contemporary issues, and no better place or reason to do so than on this podcast. So I hope you find it informative.
It's not just the dislocation of our forces that gets targeted, it's all the civilian infrastructure, schools, kindergartens, hospitals, cultural buildings. Russians love to destroy not just Ukrainians physically, but culturally and mentally. They're trying to wipe us off from the face of the earth.
Welcome back to the World Extreme Medicine podcast with myself, Owen Walker. In this episode, we are looking at an update of the Ukraine crisis with Mark, Luca, and Alione. So what I wanted to do in the episode is just really look at the current logistical aid efforts, look at the implementation, the current climate, and our guests' anecdotal reflections in Ukraine at the moment. So we also wanted to dig into the cadence of change in the current climate from an infrastructural perspective, logistical efforts, and the real need on the ground from our guests' anecdotal experience. So to do this, I firstly have Mark Hannaford with me. Mark is the CEO and founder of World Extreme Medicine. So since its inception, WEM has trained over 20,000 medics in extreme medicine and has a global platform that hosts the world's first MSc in extreme medicine program at Exeter University, and plenty of other endeavours. Welcome, Mark, to the podcast.
Thank you, Owen. Nice to be here.
Next, I have Alione Hlivco with me. Alione is a former MP in Ukraine. She is a regular contributor at Chatham House, CapX, and is a TEDx speaker. Welcome, Alione, to the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And finally, we have Luca Alfatti with us. Luca is the head of operations for Medics for Ukraine, and he has assisted in delivering over £1.7 million worth of medical aid to Ukraine, as well as several trauma courses to frontline soldiers and medics. He's also an advanced paramedic within the UK. Welcome, Luca, to the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I thought if we could just kick off initially, Mark, with just digging into what the current climate looks like on the ground from your anecdotal experience.
I think it would be great to answer this and then have Alione add into this. I think from Luca and I's perspective, from Medics for Ukraine, there's a sense of impending change in so much as the winter has led to relatively static lines. There has been lots of conflict going backwards and forwards, but no massive changes. But I think as the spring approaches and goes then into summer, where we are expecting something to happen for the conflict to pick up its pace, sadly, for civilians to be caught up in that change and that conflict, and for essentially the line to go one way or the other. And it really, in some respects, is anybody's guess which way that might go. Of course, we all here want it to go one particular way, but there are some things not everybody can control. So there's a sense of preparation for that upcoming offensive, which inevitably will happen as the sort of winter eases. And there's a sense, I think, from our perspective, certainly from Luca and I, is that we need to be getting as much training and convoys and supply runs into Ukraine as we possibly can during this kind of interim period. And just to update, I mean, when we spoke last, it was 1.7. We're getting really close now to almost £2 million worth of trauma supplies going into Ukraine. So we're pretty pleased with that. But, there is no end in sight, unfortunately, to the conflict, and the need is only growing. So we'll reach that milestone and pass it quite quickly, I think. I don't know what your thoughts are from Ukraine.
I think for sure the need for medical supplies will only grow, especially over the next few months. Unfortunately, the counteroffensive of Russian forces has already started. Their big spring offensive that everyone was expected. It is quite dragged out and prolonged. It is mostly in the east. There's little chance for them to start attacking from the north, from Belarus. Again, as they did a year ago. But, the Donbass region has now been deemed as a meat grinder, which is an absolutely horrific word to use, but that's what most military experts have been using in the last few months, that despite the difficulty for the heavy artillery to go through from the Russian side and quite difficult circumstances for Ukrainian army to protect themselves in those areas where it's quite open. The terrain is very difficult and heavy on casualties. And, there have been these waves of Russian forces just coming towards Ukrainians, and for the lack of expertise and heavy effective artillery, they've just been throwing people at the front line with very little training and knowledge how to lead the war strategically. So the casualties have been immense, unfortunately, on the Ukrainian side too. And sadly, I think we're bracing ourselves for another very difficult period over the next few months.
So, Alione, on the ground, what does it feel like from a sort of risk profile, or indeed just some of your anecdotal experience of how the locals are feeling from a risk and the jeopardy to their own health?
Well, there's really no place in Ukraine right now. No matter where you are, whether you're close to the front line in the east, whether you're directly in those towns that are being contested now, the occupied territories are, of course, the most dangerous place to be. And luckily, many civilians have been evacuated from there, but even more have been unfortunately relocated to Russia or killed off, tortured, detained, etc. I mean, we're only finding out about those instances when the territories get liberated. On the front line, of course, you could see that it's not just the dislocation of our forces that gets targeted, it's all the civilian infrastructure, schools, kindergartens, hospitals, cultural buildings. Russians love to destroy not just Ukrainians physically, but culturally and mentally. They're trying to wipe us off from the face of the earth. So really no place is safe. And as we see from the constant bombardment and missiles flying all over Ukraine, they have managed to reach basically every region. So you never know where it might strike. I think every day, especially when we have some sort of victory on the international arena, like the recent visit of President Zelensky to the UK and then to the EU. The next day when he came back to Ukraine, there was a gift for him of 70 missiles flying towards Ukraine. The Ukrainian air defense system is getting better, so that's good news. I think more and more out of 70 missiles, for example, the latest biggest launch, about 60 of those were shot down, and fewer hit civilian targets, and less people are getting hurt as a result. But still, we're seeing quite a dangerous scene throughout the Ukraine. The hometown where I'm from, for example, in the west of Ukraine, where many volunteers have their bases and warehouses and go through the city and the region on the way from Romania. There's another logistical connecting point in Lviv, which is on the border with Poland. And then some people come in through Odessa, flying in from Moldova and Romania again into the south. That's the closest route. Even those places are not safe because we're getting missiles from the Black Sea. from their carriers. Very often you can see on the news that those missiles fly above Moldovan and Romanian airspace, which is, of course, NATO territory in case of Romania. So no place is safe, and it's better to be cautious all the time.
Luca, from your anecdotal experience on the ground, I mean, you've delivered several of these trauma courses, but could you speak to the real need on the ground that you see?
Yeah, the real need on the ground is not really changed since the beginning. It's just grown bigger, and as exactly as Alione was saying, just the civilians and military casualties have exponentially increased, especially in the last few days, weeks, and this is going to go on for a few weeks more. It is, in a certain sense, isolated to the Donbass region, which is huge. Anyway, I mean, Ukraine is massive, it is a massive country, and the Donbass itself, even if it looks like a small region, is actually really big. If you draw a line from Kiev all straight across to Luhansk, basically, all that area, southeast, it's the meat grinder, as Alione was saying, and Kherson, which is actually a city we've been supporting heavily with our medical supplies, trauma, but it's not just trauma supplies that we deliver. We deliver a lot of other medical equipment. It's sort of like I think it's rated as the third deadliest city in Ukraine at the moment, just because of the logistics of how it's set up. The army is just on the other side of the river, hence there is no getting away from having to fight in the city pretty much. So the needs are still is trauma supplies and understanding of very first trauma impact medical aid, if you like, and then again, following what Alione was saying, hospitals have been targeted as well. So there's not really any hospitals where you can take casualties, which then creates a really difficult, long, prolonged field care transfers of the casualties that actually are alive and maybe can make it. And don't forget as well, there is a huge mix of military and civilians in these regions, and a lot of people in mimetics, in army fatigues, they are actually non-professional military. A lot of them are actually civilians who have, embraced the cause, and they're basically fighting for their country. So there's a whole mixed bag of injuries. From initially, actually, was mainly blast injuries, traumatic brain injuries, that sort of stuff. But recently, there has been a bit of a change, and the front lines are very close, and there is more sort of like face-to-face, man-to-man, shooting range, if you like. It's not just the missiles and the missile strikes, meaning that the injury pattern is not changing. There is still the same injury pattern, but we are adding to it with bullet wounds and stuff like that. So it's a huge need, if that answers your question.
So, Luca, could you maybe speak to, because as you were saying, the risk is dynamic at the moment. Could you maybe speak to how Medics for Ukraine manages the risk in Ukraine?
So it's difficult, as you would expect, and again, the whole of Ukraine is a battleground due to the missile strikes. They can just hit anywhere. Yes, the air defense is much improved, but it's still 60, 70, 80 missiles at the time. And you also got to think about when they shoot them down, all the debris and so on. So it's difficult. Since day one, we've been working with Ukrainians, with local trusted brothers now, and sisters, member of the team for just short of a year. And basically, it's about working with some risk management companies that help us with risk assessments, and then people on the ground. We got some people on the ground in Kherson as we speak, for example, and we get live updates on what the situation is. We are very, very careful about sending any Western anywhere in Ukraine. Because we got very good network of obviously Ukrainian volunteers for delivery of medical supplies. We were able to get medical supplies within Kherson city when it was occupied, for example. We literally just managed to get some of our medical aid to Bakhmut, for example, just a few days back. And it's thanks to a very intricate network of local volunteers that we managed to get the kit where we need to get it to. But it's ever changing. We're always on the phone. We're always basically getting information on a daily basis. And, we try our best, but it's difficult.
Mark, could you speak to the educational aspect of the programme and how it's been going? And indeed, if there's any plans for expansion of the educational courses at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Owen. I think I'll probably get Luca to tack on to the end of this as well, because we've developed the educational program together. So when Luca and I originally went to Ukraine and decided that, given our unique network and our kind of set of skills and the people that are associated with WEM, that we could do something really useful and support the other aid agencies that were deployed to the Ukraine. We originally went with the idea to focus on pediatric hospitals and clinics, but we really very quickly realised that whilst there was a need there, it wasn't as overriding and as urgent as the need for trauma supplies to the front line. That's kind of obvious, but also training of medics going to and deploying to the front line. And I think initially we were reluctant to do, focus on the military, but actually, given that so much of the civilian population is now military, essentially it feels like that whilst we're training units and we're training soldiers, medics who are deploying in sort of TCCC, so tactical combat care, we're actually in effect training civilians, because this is not a largely professional army now. This is, Luca's intimated and said, these are volunteers who are dressed in uniform fighting for their country and for their land. And then, so for us, that makes that training that we're giving, it feels to us even more meaningful, because these are people who could be our cousins, they could be family members, they could be our children, and so training them to be able to deliver as effective medical care to their colleagues and comrades as they possibly can feels meaningful, but also trying to keep them as safe as we possibly can in what are horrendous combat conditions, giving them some of the tools and the intuition to keep themselves alive so that they can help more people feels really more meaningful. And I think, the trauma supplies are tangible, but the training in a way feels even more meaningful because it's long term, and it directly saves lives. It's hard to, as Alione mentioned, highlighted, the spring offensive that has already started. It hasn't started with a dramatic frontal assault, which I kind of think, maybe that's what we were led by the media to expect. But it's certainly started by a massive increase of pressure on the front line. Whether that's going to allow us to expand our training, or whether the need for what we're doing is going to stay focused, we would love to have the capacity and have the ability to be also able to train civilian response units and disaster response units. And we are starting to do more of that, but certainly that would be an area that we would really like to expand in, to do our training to big civilian groups as well, so that, when the missiles do get through and there are impacts on the ground, that we've trained the people responding there to do their job better as well. Or that's the wrong way of putting that, I think. Giving them the benefit of some of our experience, because they're doing an amazing job anyway. So we're limited a little bit by resource and what we can do. And also Luca and I have been really, really, we constantly remind ourselves, because it's so easy to let this mission kind of expand, and by expand become diluted and less focused. We've been really, really focused on what we're doing, so that what we do really well. We do in a really targeted way. And actually, as we do it, we improve based on the feedback that we're getting from the people that we're teaching. So we'd love to expand, but whether the situation is going to allow us to, depending on the level of conflict, that kind of remains to be seen. But certainly there's potential, and we've got a whole host of people, volunteers, medical professionals here who would love to be involved. Now, Luca, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that.
No, it's pretty much exactly what you said, and I really want to emphasize that point about militaries being civilians, because that is exactly what it is. I remember I'll just give you this quick anecdote, and Mark, you were there as well. We trained, I think, about 50 or 60, a team of 50 or 60 soldiers in the region of, I think it was Bucha region, somewhere around Bucha. And even though they looked like soldiers, none of them had been deployed, and none of them actually had their military training yet. So it's the whole of Ukraine, the civilians, the population of Ukraine that is actually fighting against, the invasor pretty much. It's not just a professional action. I've got the feeling the professional army, it's shrinking, and obviously the population is getting more and more drawn into this. And I feel very proud of what we're doing, because the majority of the teams we have trained, and it's about over 400 people now, the vast majority were not professional soldiers or professional medics. And even when we had doctors or paramedics or medical professionals, they loved the fact that basically seeing us there meant so there is people out there that is helping us, that want us to succeed, and at the same time we're just giving more reassurance, I think, that what they were doing is what they know it's right. There is a hunger for this training. There's a big hunger to have us there. So yeah, it's a population, is the civilians that as well as our target.
Alione, could you maybe speak to your current role at the moment on the ground, just raising the profile and awareness of the current climate, and indeed just networking and fostering sort of aid into the country? Could you maybe sort of expand on that?
Yes, I think every Ukrainian these days, no matter where we are in the world, and me being based in London, we all try to contribute in whatever capacity we have and wherever we could be most useful. Obviously, it's one of the roles that I've taken on is spreading awareness as much as I can, and demystifying Ukraine and getting rid of that propaganda narrative that was installed by Russians for many, many years in Europe about Ukraine. First of all, if you remember, even that's such a distant reality now, but when the war started, people were still asking me questions whether there are Nazis in Ukraine and what the Ukrainians were about, and maybe Donbass is just fully Russian and Crimea never meant to be as part of Ukraine. So just opening Ukraine up to the world and letting people know that we're just human beings living in the center of Europe who really just want to choose our European path, being part of a civilized world and rules-based order. And so that's probably been the most difficult mission, I would say, because very often you need to be well placed and put together and well articulated, when very often you also just get affected by all the events back home and you just want to break down and cry of all the things. Apart from that, of course, the volunteer effort in London community has been immense. I think for the first 3 months of the war, at the very least, there were many formations of Ukrainians here on the ground. Through Ukrainian Social Club, we were there until probably like 2-3 a.m. every night, kind of getting all the aids that Londoners and generally the whole of UK society, I think, was sending to London, bringing over to this hub and sending off to Ukraine via trucks. I think it was great meeting Luca and Mark as well with their effort with medical supplies, and I've tried to also put them in touch with Ukrainian policymakers and healthcare committee and in the Parliament of Ukraine and the International Aid Committee. And I think their contribution and training of the medics on the ground was highly regarded and much appreciated, because it was really such a concerted volunteer effort where Ukraine was appreciating any help that was coming in, because even though in some aspects Ukraine was prepared for the war, in other aspects it completely wasn't. And I think that initial help that came through was very important. And that was the professional side of it. But I can definitely relate to what Mark was saying and on the back of what Luca was saying about helping the civilians effectively, because one of those civilians turned soldiers is my brother, actually, who had zero military experience and just volunteered to go fight for his country when the time came, because he is of a conscription age. And he is now actually being sent in few weeks' time, maybe even sooner. He's going straight to Bakhmut. So it's a critical time for us. Again, he was a part of liberation of Izium and Liman near Kharkiv, so he's seen most of those horrific things firsthand. And it was almost surreal and bizarre when I was trying to send him packages as much as I can, because he didn't have combat shoes, he didn't have any thermals when he got conscripted, all the basics really, because everyone just got conscripted and the state couldn't really figure out the logistics quickly enough. So of course all the relatives and volunteers kicked in. And I remember while I was sending him the bulletproof vest, I managed to source, really, I think I found the last supply on Amazon, and with the producer of wound healing Celox, which I'm sure Mark and Luca know very well of. And I remember finding myself getting very basic instruction from the producers of Celox tapes and the powder, the little granules, that, there's a difference between covering an open wound and dealing with the bullet wounds. I had to really get a crash course on that myself to be ordered to send at least some supply to my brother, hysterically hoping for him to survive in whatever comes his way, and explaining that to him on the phone once he's received it, really as explicitly as I could, what the difference is, how you use it, because effectively, if you don't use it the right way, Luca and Mark will know better than me, it might cause into a greater damage and effectively loss of life. So just giving that, initial information, civilian to civilian, just for my brother to know how to use that firsthand, if anything, God forbids, happens. It was a surreal experience for me, and that really made me realize that those trainings and those trips that they do to Ukraine, I'm sure, saved so many lives and were extremely useful.
Listen, that's powerful, and it just really illustrates the need and the importance of this training actually on the ground, and that's a powerful example actually, Alione. So as an adjoining question to Alione's last answer, Mark and to Luca, maybe Mark first, could you speak to maybe the sort of diversity of kit which is sort of being sent out to Ukraine, and indeed what kind of kit you might need going forward for distribution to the communities?
I think I'm going to answer this in two bits, but I'm going to get Luca to answer most of it, because the responsibility for kit primarily falls to Luca. But what I would say that in the last year since we've been doing this, and we set ourselves an original target of raising £100,000 worth of kit, and we thought that was going to be a challenge, and we'd be pleased and proud of ourselves if we got to that. And as we near £2 million, it's due to the generosity of people that have supported us and the disparate nature of those supporters, from people working as paramedics for trusts, for Coast Guard volunteers and rescue workers who have stretchers and kits sitting in their cupboards that has been sitting there for a couple of years, to every person walking in the street. And I started. We started Medics for Ukraine. We started fundraising in my village in Devon, which is a pretty small village on the coast of Devon. it was them that gave me the original confidence that we were going to be able to do this, because within a week or so, we'd already raised almost £10,000 just from our local village. So people's support has been absolutely incredible. And that's reflected in the type of kit and equipment and supplies that have come into us. But in terms of, and as I mentioned, we've tried to stay really close and really targeted, because that allows us to keep our operation quite nimble and quite agile, but also simplifies it for Luca and I, so that we can do the best job possible. And Luca's been doing an amazing, simply phenomenal job in gathering that kit and the suppliers together. So I'd rather, if you don't mind, hand that sort of core question over to Luca.
Sure, why not? So I'm actually going to read it, and I'm going to read you a list. This probably not everyone is going to understand it, but I'm like, you know what? We're going to do this podcast tonight. I'm going to get a live update straight from the front line of what it's needed medically. And this has arrived about 5 minutes ago, because we are in continuous communication with our partners and the people in the units that we supply in the front line. Israeli bandages, chest seals, MPAs, decompression needles, burns dressings, and of course, what Aliona was mentioning is hemostatic agents are always, since day one, have been huge, always first on the list. And as you all know, if you are in the trade, they are expensive and they're really difficult to supply in big quantities unless you have the right fundings. Tourniquets are always high in the it's always first on a wish list, and obviously, so the sort of is the sort of like trench, if you like, frontline. Primary care that we don't think about: painkillers, anti-flus, anti-fungi creams, that sort of stuff, or individual first aid kits itself. So IFAKs as pouches with first aid in it, where they can have it on themselves. Other bigger requests, again, they've always been very big numbers since day one. Ambulances or vehicles. They don't even have to be ambulances, just vehicles. They just get battered, shot at, missiles. And there was a huge drive of ambulances probably about 6 or 7 months ago. I wouldn't be surprised if they're all battered and destroyed by now. So vehicles is huge. Oxygen cylinders is another lately. Another big request due to the long, prolonged field care hours sometimes, from point of injury to, I would say, I'll call it definitive care, but it's not really definitive care. So, and there is more. There is a lot more, but that is specifically what I just got requested tonight. And that happens every day or every week. And we tend to, our fundings, as limited as they are, we try to keep them for trauma boxes. Okay, and the idea of the trauma box is to have a small field clinic just behind the front line, where you can stabilize a few patients before they get put in an ambulance or in a vehicle or in a truck, and first aid kits, individual first aid kits. But then we've actually been delivering everything and anything that's been donated to us. From recently, last week, we actually sent out 2 ophthalmic lamps, for example, because obviously there is still a whole civilian population that is not necessarily involved in war, and they still get sick and they still need primary care. We're sending equipment for a small clinic just in the next convoy that's been donated to us from a clinic in London. We've been sending loads of hydrocortisone to a hospital in Kiev. So anything that is medical, we've been able to basically place in the right place, not necessarily frontline. Ourselves, with the small fundings that we're getting, we're focusing on trauma supplies, but we've been delivering absolutely anything and everything.
So, Alione, I'll come to you for the next question, but just briefly before I do, Mark, if someone's listening to this and wants to contribute and maybe hasn't got access to medical supplies, how could they maybe contribute, either monetary or time, efforts or intention? Where could they go?
Thanks, Aaron. I mean, essentially the operational cost of Medics for Ukraine gets covered by myself and World Extreme Medicine. So, we could do with some support there, some financial support that was directed towards operational support, because that would allow us to expand our capacities and also allow us to continue doing the training and the convoys. There are lots of hospitals and hospital trusts, doctors' clinics, paramedic trusts, where they've got material that's starting to come out of date. We would love to have access to those types of supplies so we can fill our trauma convoys and take them to Ukraine, because they'd be used so quickly that actually being slightly out of date wouldn't be an issue. We have a fundraising page on GoFundMe for Medics for Ukraine. People can donate individually there. But if it's we have a number of supporters that do support us long term, would be best to reach out to us directly via World Extreme Medicine.
And listen, we'll put the links in the show notes to those pages you mentioned there, so people can access them nice and quickly. As we're starting to come into land in the conversation, Alione, I just wondered if you could speak to the amazing resolve from the Ukrainian people, both on the ground, from what you see in London, and just this real groundswell of true character which is coming through from the Ukrainian people.
I think it's been very reassuring to see that the world finally gets to see what Ukrainians are about, what we're like. That resolve has obviously not been news to us. And I personally have grown and matured in Ukraine through two revolutions in Ukraine that were aimed at fighting for democracy and getting away from authoritarian tendencies and post-Soviet traditions of politics and state functioning to democracy. And it always came from people. The first one in 2004 was peaceful. The next one in 2014 actually had first bloodshed. And now, as we're approaching the 1-year anniversary of the full-scale war against Ukraine, we're also approaching the anniversary of the beginning of this war in 2014 and the first casualties at the Revolution of Dignity on Maidan in Ukraine, which actually prompted Putin to start war in Ukraine, because he saw that we were clearly getting out of his grip and moving towards Europe finally. So I saw that resolve probably firsthand, seeing people on Maidan protesting and standing up for their own freedom of choice of their future for their children, obviously, and sacrificing their lives. And it was quite traumatic. And then when the war started, just seeing most of those people from Maidan going straight to the war to protect Donbass, having lost Crimea already very quickly, I think that resolve only grew. And Ukrainians saw that, with years. And I think that's something that the Western world needs to realize, that Russia will never let us be and leave us at peace. And no really temporary truce will ever resolve this. Because their only goal is to exterminate us. And I suppose in a terrible way, but also in a good way for Ukrainians, for our social cohesion and resolve, facing that genocidal war on us, corroborated through centuries, really. We have finally come together as a nation very strongly, and I think that's definitely something that has been key to us lasting this long, surviving, and eventually winning this war.
Listen, that's a great place to finish. All I will just ask is that if there's any final thoughts, indeed, Mark or Luca, that you'd like listeners to hear.
I guess it's an appeal for support. Luca and I, as I mentioned, we started off with relatively small goals. Our vision has expanded, but also our connection to Ukraine and the people of Ukraine and people like Alione has strengthened over time with our volunteers that are, taking massive risks to get our supplies to the front line. And also our UK volunteers who want to drive stuff to Poland for transshipment into Ukraine, but also the trainers that go deep into the country to provide training. Our connection is strengthened and deepened, and we're here to the end, really, which hopefully will be soon, but we have to be pragmatic. It probably won't be as soon as we hope, in terms of our support for the Ukrainian people. Luca.
I think you said it all. Yeah. No, support.
It's unusual, Luca.
Yeah, yes, he's so much better than me speaking. But yes, support, and it's not support for us; it's support for Ukraine, obviously. And yes, we all would like it to finish soon, but we are being realistic here. We actually have 2 teams going out training in the next less than 4 weeks' time. We got another convoy that literally just came back yesterday, and another one going in 2 or 3 weeks' time. So any support, being monetary, being voluntary, being kit, will take it because it's needed.
Listen, thank you so much to all 3 of you for the past half an hour. It's been really powerful just hearing your first-hand experience, and a really powerful message as well. So thank you for your time and insights. We'll put in the show notes links to everything you mentioned regarding Medics for Ukraine and where people can give. But thank you once again for your time.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.